8. He blinked his eyes open slowly the next morning. Warm sunlight filtered in through the window. He smelled salt in the air. It felt like a lovely dream. And then the reality burst through, and he remembered where he was and what he'd seen. "Oh dear," he muttered roughly as he sat up in the bed, rubbing a hand over his face. Calliope lay curled at the edge of the bed near his feet, tail swishing back and forth, eyes closed. He yawned as he pulled the comforter back, putting his feet on the floor. He stretched, popping his back. Regardless of the situation he'd found himself in, he had to admit he hadn't had such a good night's sleep since he could remember. Between that, the morning sunlight, and the distant crash of the waves, he could almost pretend that this was nothing but a well-earned holiday, and that he was... Something cold and wet wrapped around his ankle. Linus screamed as he jerked his legs up. In his fear, he miscalculated his own strength, and his legs went up and over his head as he somersaulted backward and off the other side of the bed. He landed on the floor on his back with a jarring crash, breath leaving his lungs in a spectacular fashion. He turned his head toward the underside of the bed. "Hello," Chauncey said, eyes dancing on the end of their stalks. "I'm not actually trying to scare you. It's almost time for breakfast. We're having eggs." Linus looked back up toward the ceiling and waited for his heartbeat to slow. Department in charge of Magical Youth, Case Report Number 1, Marcius Orphanage. Linus Baker. Caseworker BY 78941. I solemnly swear that the contents of this report are accurate and true. I understand, per Dicamy guidelines, that any discoverable falsehoods will result in censure and could lead to termination. This report, and the ones to follow, will contain the observations I've made throughout each week of my investigation. Marcius Island and the orphanage herein are not what I expected. It should be noted that the files given to me for this assignment are woefully inadequate, leaving out pertinent facts that I believe could have prepared me for what this investigation will entail. Either parts of the files were missing, or they've been redacted. If it's the former, then this is a serious breach of conduct. If it's the latter, my temporary classification level should have negated that. I would recommend a review of protocols for all classified Level 4 assignments in the future, to make sure no other caseworker walks into a situation without the required knowledge. My apologies if this comes across as demanding. I merely believe more should have been provided. The Marcius Orphanage isn't what I thought it would be. The house itself is foreboding, though it appears to be well maintained. It is large, and the interior is cluttered, although in a way that makes it feel like a lived-in home rather than the sanctuary of a hoarder. Aside, of course, from the actual hoard that belongs to the Wyvern Theodore, but I've yet to see what that consists of exactly. The children each have their own rooms. In these first few days, I've seen the interiors of those belonging to the gnome Talia. The walls are adorned with more flowers than appear to be in the entirety of the garden. The sprite Fee, I do believe her bed is actually a tree growing through the floorboards, though for the life of me, I can't figure out how that's possible. The Chauncey, there is standing salt water on the floor that I am assured gets swabbed out once a week, and Theodore. He's built a nest in the attic that I was only allowed to see once I gave him another button. Since I didn't have a spare, I had to snip one from one of my dress shirts. I assume I will be compensated for this. I have not seen the room belonging to Sal yet. He doesn't trust me, and actually appears to be terrified of me, though through no fault of his own. He rarely says a word in my presence, but given his history, I can understand why. A history, I might add, I was not privy to, as his file mostly discusses the abilities of his shift, leaving, of course, the most important part out. While this is certainly fascinating, I would suggest that it's not enough. I'm told this is his 12th orphanage. This information would have allowed me a better understanding upon my arrival. I haven't seen Lucy's room. I haven't asked. He has offered many times. Once he cornered me and whispered that I wouldn't believe my eyes, but I don't think I'm ready to see it yet. I will make sure to view it before I leave. If it is the last thing I do, my last will and testament has been filed with Human Resources. If enough of my remains exist, please see that they are cremated. It should be noted that in addition to the children, there is an island sprite called Zoe Chapelwhite. The fact that I was not made aware of her presence until arrival is most unusual. Sprites, as I'm sure you're aware, are highly territorial. I came to an island that is ostensibly hers without an invitation directly from her. It would have been well within her rights to deny me entrance, or worse. This suggests that either Daikami wasn't aware of her, or didn't feel the need to make me aware of her existence. Which brings me to Mr. Parnassus. His file consisted of a single page that told me nothing of the master of Marsyas Orphanage. This certainly will not do. I know that I can always ask him to tell me about himself, but I would prefer to read about him instead of engaging in conversation. I am here to observe and report. The fact that I must become a conversationalist, in addition to my current duties, is vexing. There is something about him, Mr. Parnassus, that I can't quite put my finger on. He certainly seems capable. The children appear to be happy, possibly even thriving. Mr. Parnassus has the uncanny ability to know where the children are at all times and what they're doing, even if they're out of sight. He's unlike anyone else I've met before. Perhaps speaking to him won't be such a difficult task after all, and I will need to. Because regardless of how happy the children seem to be, the house appears to be on the verge of chaos. Upon my arrival, the children were roaming the grounds of the island. I'm told they're allowed to foster their own pursuits for a time each day, but it seems unwise to allow these specific children to be unsupervised for any significant amount of time. It's well documented that magical youth are not in complete control of whatever powers they possess, some less than others. That being said, I understand the need for secrecy here, given who these children are. I must admit that it might be a bit overblown. Regardless of their backgrounds, they are just children after all. How problematic could they possibly be with the guidelines set forth in rules and regulations?
Fire and ash,
Lucy bellowed as he paced back and forth.
Death and destruction. I, the harbinger of calamity, will bring pestilence and plague to the people of this world. The blood of the innocents will sustain me, and you will all fall to your knees in benediction as I am your God.
He bowed. The children and Mr. Parnassus clapped politely. Theodore chirped and spun in a circle. Linus gaped. That was a lovely story, Lucy, Mr. Parnassus said. I especially liked your use of metaphors. Keep in mind that pestilence and plague are technically the same thing, so it did get a little repetitious at the end. But other than that, quite impressive. Well done. They were in the parlor of the main house, which had been converted into a classroom. There were 6 small desks lined up in front of a larger one. An old green chalkboard was set near the window, looking as if it had recently been scrubbed clean. Thick pieces of chalk were set in a box near the floor. There was a map of the Earth on one wall, and a projector sitting on a metal stand in a corner. The walls were lined with books, much like Mr. Parnassus's office was. There were encyclopedias and novels and non-fiction books about Greek gods and goddesses, and the scientific names of flora and fauna. And Linus thought he'd seen one with gold lettering on the spine that said, "The History of Gnomes, Cultural Relevance and Their Place in Society." It appeared to be at least 1,000 pages long, and Linus was itching to get his hands on it. Lucy took a seat at his desk, looking rather pleased with himself. He'd been the second to last to perform in what Mr. Parnassus indicated was a block in the curriculum known as Expressing Yourself. The children were invited to the front of the class in order to tell a story of their own creation, either true or made up. Talia had told a rather pointed tale of an intruder who came to an island and was never heard from again. Theodore, according to Mr. Parnassus, had spun a jaunty limerick that caused everyone, except for Linus, to laugh until they had tears in their eyes. Fee spoke of a specific tree in the woods that she was growing and her hopes for its roots. Chauncey regaled them with the history of bellhops, something Linus gathered that was an ongoing series. And then there was Lucy. Lucy, who had stood atop Mr. Parnassus's desk and basically threatened the entire planet with annihilation, his little fists above his head, eyes blazing. Expressing yourself was, according to Mr. Parnassus, an idea that would give the children confidence. Linus knew all too well the horrors of having to speak in front of an audience. Twice a week, the children were required to speak in front of the others about whatever topic they fancied. In addition to giving them an opportunity to practice public speaking, Mr. Parnassus said he believed it to be a creative outlet. "The minds of children are wondrous things," he said to Linus as they followed the others toward the parlor. "Some of the things they come up with seem to defy the imagination." Linus understood that wholeheartedly. He absolutely believed that Lucy was capable of everything he'd shouted. Linus sat in a chair at the back of the parlor. He'd been offered a seat much closer, but he'd shaken his head, saying it was best if he sat out of the way to observe. He had his notepad and pencil ready, set atop his copy of Rules and Regulations, something he'd thought to leave in his room but decided against. One should always be prepared should the rules need to be reviewed. When the first child had stood in front, but it'd been quickly forgotten. He reminded himself that he needed to take copious notes so his reports weren't lacking, especially since there was nothing in the Rules and Regulations about children expressing themselves in such a manner. And since Lucy was finished, that meant 5 children had expressed themselves, which left... "Sal," Mr. Parnassus said, "if you please." Sal slumped lower in his chair, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. It was almost comical, given his size. He glanced back at Linus quickly before jerking his head forward again when he saw he was being watched. He muttered something that Linus couldn't make out. Mr. Parnassus stood in front of his desk. He reached down and tapped a finger on Sal's shoulder. He said, "The things we fear the most are often the things we should fear the least. It's irrational, but it's what makes us human. And if we're able to conquer those fears, then there is nothing we're not capable of." Theodore chirped from the top of his desk, wings fluttering. "Theodore's right," Fee said, chin in her hands. "You can do it, Sal." Chauncey's eyes bounced. "Yeah, you got this."
"You're made of strong stuff on the inside," Talia said. "And it's what's on the inside that counts."
Lucy tilted his head back and stared at the ceiling.
"My insides are rotted and festering like an infected wound leaking pus."
"See," Mr. Parnassus said to Sal. "Everyone here believes in you. All it takes is you believing in yourself." Sal glanced back at Linus again, who tried to give what he hoped was an encouraging smile. It must not have gone over very well, as Sal grimaced, but either he had found the courage or resigned himself that he wasn't getting out of it, because he opened the lid to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He stood slowly. He was stiff as he walked to the front of the class. Mr. Parnassus sat on the edge of his desk. His slacks were still too short, and revealed socks that were a brightly offensive shade of orange. Sal stood in front of the class, staring at the paper gripped tightly in his hands. The paper shook slightly. Linus sat statue still, sure that any movement from him would send Sal running. Sal's lips started moving, his murmur barely audible. "A little louder," Mr. Parnassus said softly. "Everyone wants to hear you. Project, Sal. Your voice is a weapon. Never forget that." His fingers tightened around the page in his hands. Linus thought it would rip. Sal cleared his throat and began again. He said, "I am but paper, brittle and thin. I am held up to the sun and it shines right through me. I get written on and I can never be used again. These scratches are a history. They're a story. They tell things for others to read, but they only see the words and not what the words are written upon. I am but paper, and though there are many like me, none are exactly the same. I am parched parchment. I have lines. I have holes. Get me wet and I melt. Light me on fire and I burn. Take me in hardened hands and I crumple. I tear. I am but paper. brittle and thin. He hurried back to his seat. Everyone cheered. Linus stared. "Wonderful," Mr. Parnassus said approvingly. "Thank you for that, Sal. I particularly like the scratches as a history. It spoke to me because we all have that history, I think, though none are quite the same as the others, as you so deftly pointed out. Well done." Linus could have sworn he saw Sal smile, but it was gone before he could be sure. Mr. Parnassus clapped his hands. "Well then, shall we move on? Since it's Tuesday, that means we will begin the morning with maths." Everyone groaned. Theodore thunked his head repeatedly against the surface of his desk. "And yet, we'll still proceed," Mr. Parnassus said, sounding amused. "Fee, would you hand out the primers? Today we're going to return to the wild and wonderful world of algebra. Advanced for some, and an opportunity to refresh for others. How lucky are we?" Even Linus groaned at that. Linus left the guest house after lunch, preparing to return to the parlor for what was promising to be an exciting discussion on the Magna Carta, when Miss Chapelwhite appeared out of nowhere, startling him to the point where he almost stumbled back against the porch. "Why would you do that?" he gasped, clutching at his chest, sure that his poor heart was about to explode. "My blood pressure is high as it is. Are you trying to kill me?" "If I'd wanted to kill you, I know many other ways to go about it," she said easily. "You need to come with me." "I shall do no such thing. I have children to observe and a report that I've barely begun. And besides, the rules and regulations state that a caseworker mustn't let himself be distracted when on assignment, and it's important." He eyed her warily. Why? Her wings fluttered behind her. Even though it was impossible, she appeared to grow until she towered above him. "I am the Sprite of Marsyas. This is my island. You are here because I have allowed you to be. You would do well to remember that, Mr. Baker." Yes, of course," he said hastily. "What I meant to say was, I will definitely come with you wherever you ask me to go." He swallowed thickly. "Within reason." She snorted as she took a step back. "Your bravery knows no bounds," he bristled. "Now see here, just because—" "Do you have other shoes?" He looked down at his loafers. "Yes, but they're pretty much the same. Why?" She shrugged. "We'll be walking through the forest." "Oh, well, perhaps we could postpone that for another day." But she had already turned and started walking away from him. He gave very serious consideration to ignoring her and going back to the relative safety of the main house, but then he remembered that she could banish him if she wanted to. And part of him, albeit a small part, was curious about what she wanted to show him. It'd been a long time since he'd been curious about anything at all. Besides, it was a perfectly lovely day. Perhaps it would do him some good to be outside in all this sunshine. 10 minutes later, he wished for death. If Talia had come to him with her shovel, he didn't think he'd have stopped her. If Lucy had stood above him, eyes blazing, fire burning, he would have welcomed him with open arms. Anything to keep from hiking in the woods. "I'm thinking," he gasped, sweat pouring off his brow, "that a bit of a break is in order. How does that sound? Lovely, I believe." Miss Chapelwhite glanced back at him, a frown on her face. She didn't look winded in the slightest. "It's not much farther." "Oh," Linus managed to say. Great, that's great." He tripped over a tree root, but managed to keep himself upright by the grace of God. "And I hope that measurements of distance and time are the same for sprites as they are for humans. Meaning, not much farther is exactly as it sounds?" "You don't get out much, do you?" He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "I get out as much as is required of someone of my position." "Into nature, I mean." "Oh, then, no. I prefer the comfort and, dare I say, safety of my home. I would rather sit in my chair and listen to my music, thank you very much." She held back a large tree limb for him. "You've always wanted to see the ocean." Dreams are merely that, dreams. They're meant to be flights of fancy. They're not necessarily supposed to come true.
And yet, here you are by the sea, far from your chair and home.
She stopped and turned her face toward the sky.
There's music everywhere, Mr. Baker. You just have to learn to listen for it.
He followed her gaze. Above them, trees swayed, the wind rustling through the leaves. Branches creaked, birds called. He thought he heard the chatter of squirrels. And underneath it all, the song of the ocean, waves against the shore, the scent of salt heavy in the air. It's nice, he admitted. Not the hiking part. I could do without that, if I'm being honest. Rather uncomfortable for someone like me.
You're wearing a tie in the middle of the woods.
I hadn't planned on being in the middle of the woods, he snapped. In fact, I'm supposed to be in the house taking notes. She began to move again through the trees, her feet barely touching the ground.
For your investigation.
Yes, for my investigation. And if I find you're hindering me in any way...
Does Mr. Parnassus get to read your reports before you send them?
Linus narrowed his eyes as he stepped over a log overgrown with moss. Ahead, he could see flashes of white sand and the ocean. Absolutely not. That would be improper. I would never...
Good,
she said. That caused him to blink. It is?
Yes.
Why? She looked back at him.
Because you'll want to include this in your report, and I don't want him to know about it.
And with that, she stepped out onto the beach. He stared after her for a moment, before following. Walking on the beach in loafers was not something Linus enjoyed. He gave brief thought to removing them and his socks and letting his toes dig into the sand, but it fell away when he saw what was waiting for them on the beach. It was hastily built, the raft. It consisted of 4 planks of wood tied together with thick yellow twine. There was a small mast, upon which fluttered what appeared to be a flag. What is it? Linus asked, taking a step toward it, feet sinking into the wet sand. Is there someone else on the island? That's not big enough for a man or a woman. Is it a child? Miss Chapelwhite shook her head grimly.
No, it was sent here from the village. Someone launched it from their boat. I'm sure they intended it to reach the docks like the last one, but the tide brought it here.
Like the last one? Linus asked, perplexed. How many have there been?
This is the 3rd.
Why on earth would anyone... Oh dear. Miss Chapelwhite had unfurled the parchment attached to the mast. In blocky lettering were the words, "Leave. We don't want your kind here."
I haven't told Mr. Parnassus about them, she said quietly. But it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't somehow know already. He's observant.
And this is directed toward whom? The children? Mr. Parnassus? You?
All of us, I think. Though I've been here far longer than the others.
She let the flag drop back against the mast.
And they would know better if it was just me.
His brow furrowed at that chilling sentiment. Why would anyone do such a thing? They're just children. Yes, they are different than most, but that shouldn't matter.
It shouldn't,
she agreed, taking a step back, wiping her hands as if they were dirty from touching the parchment.
But it does. I told you about the village, Mr. Baker, and you asked me why they are the way they are.
And you danced around answering my question, if I recall. Her mouth was a thin line. Her wings were sparkling in the sunlight.
You're not a stupid man. That much is clear. They are the way they are because we're different. Even you asked me if I was registered only minutes after we met.
This is abuse, Linus said stiffly, trying to ignore the pointed jab. Plain and simple. Maybe the people of the village don't know exactly who inhabits this island, and that's probably for the best. But regardless of that fact, no one deserves to be made to feel lesser than they are, he frowned, especially if the government pays them for their silence. That has to be a breach of some sort of contract.
It's not only this village, Mr. Baker.
Just because you don't experience prejudice in your everyday doesn't stop it from existing for the rest of us. See something, say something, the sign on the bus had read. And everywhere, really, wasn't it? More and more lately. On buses, in newspapers, billboards, radio ads. Why, he'd even seen the words printed on a grocery bag of all places. No, he said slowly. I don't suppose it does. She looked at him, the flowers in her hair appearing as if they were in bloom. He thought they actually were. And yet, these children are separated from their peers. For the safety of others, of course, or for their own safety. Isn't that the same thing? She shook her head. No. And I think you know that. He didn't know what to say in response, so he said nothing at all. Miss Chapelwhite sighed. I wanted you to see it for yourself. So you knew more than what was in those files of yours? The children don't know, and it's best to keep it that way. Do you know who sent it? No. And Mr. Parnassus? She shrugged. He glanced around, suddenly nervous. Do you think they're in danger? Could someone come to the island and attempt to cause harm? The very thought caused his stomach to clench. It wouldn't do. Violence against any child was wrong, no matter what they were capable of. He'd seen a master of an orphanage strike a boy in the face once, just because the boy had managed to change a piece of fruit to ice. That orphanage had been shut down almost immediately, and the master charged. He'd gotten away with a slap on the wrist. Linus didn't know what had happened to the boy. The smile that grew on Miss Chapelwhite's face held no humor. In fact, Linus thought, it looked almost feral. They wouldn't dare, she said, showing far too many teeth. The moment they stepped onto my island with the intention of hurting someone in that house, it would be the last thing they'd do. He believed her. He thought hard for a moment and then said, Perhaps we should send a message in response? She cocked her head at him. Wouldn't that be against your rules and regulations? He couldn't meet her knowing gaze. I don't believe there's a subparagraph for a situation like this. What do you have in mind? You're an island sprite. Your observational skills are astounding, he snorted. Which means you control the currents around your island, correct? And the wind? You seem to know an awful lot about magical creatures, Mr. Baker. I'm very good at what I do, he said primly. He pulled his pencil from his pocket. Hold the parchment out for me, would you? She hesitated briefly before doing just that. It took him a few minutes. He had to go over each letter multiple times to make his words clear. By the time he finished, Miss Chapelwhite's smile had softened, and it was perhaps the most sincere expression he'd seen since he'd met her. I didn't think you're capable of such a thing, Mr. Baker, she said, sounding gleeful. I didn't either, he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. It's best if we don't mention this again. He helped her push the raft back into the water, though he thought she was just humoring him. She most likely didn't need his assistance. By the time the raft set sail again, parchment flapping, his loafers were wet, his socks soaked, and he was breathing heavily. But he felt lighter somehow, like he wasn't paint blending into the wall. He felt real. He felt present, almost like he could be seen. The wind picked up and the raft sailed away, back toward the mainland in the distance. He didn't know if anyone would actually find it, if it would actually make it across the channel. And even if they did find it, they'd probably ignore it. That almost didn't matter. Leave. We don't want your kind here, one side of the parchment said. No, thank you, the other side said. They stood on the beach in the sand, with water lapping at their feet, for a long time. (9) On the first Friday Linus Baker spent on the island, he received an invitation. It wasn't one he expected, and upon hearing it, he wasn't sure it was one he wanted to accept. He could think of 6 or 7 or quite possibly 100 things he'd rather do. He had to remind himself he was on Marsyas for a reason, and it was important he see all sides of the orphanage. The invitation had come from a knock on the door of the guest house, where Linus was attempting to finish his first report from his time on Marsyas. The ferry would come tomorrow to take him to the mainland, so he could send it via post back to Dykami. He'd been deep into his writing, careful to only allow 1 admonition per page regarding extremely upper management's lack of transparency before sending him to the island. He'd made it a game of sorts, trying to make his responses to their transgressions as subtle as possible. He'd been thankful for the interruption of a knock at the door, when the last line he'd written read, "And furthermore, the very idea that extremely upper management would employ obfuscation and outright deception with their caseworkers is most uncivilized." It was probably for the best if he rethought that last sentence. He was pleasantly surprised to find Mr. Parnassus standing on the porch of the guest house, looking windswept and warm in the afternoon sunlight, something that Linus was finding himself not only getting used to seeing, but rather looking forward to. He told himself it was because Mr. Parnassus was a cheery fellow, and if this were the real world, perhaps they could have been friends, something that Linus was in short supply of. That was all it was. It didn't matter that Mr. Parnassus didn't appear to own a pair of slacks that actually fit his long legs, given that they were always too short. Today he wore blue socks with clouds on them. Linus refused to be charmed. He mostly succeeded. Still, when Mr. Parnassus extended his invitation, Linus felt his throat close and his tongue become as dry as burnt toast. "Pardon?" he managed to ask. Mr. Parnassus smiled knowingly. I said it might be a good idea if you were to sit in on my one-on-one with Lucy, just so you may get the full experience of Marcius. I expect extremely upper management anticipates your observations of such, don't you think? Linus did. In fact, he was beginning to think that perhaps extremely upper management cared more about Lucy than any other person on the island. Oh, it wasn't spelled out as such in the files he'd been given, but Linus had been doing this line of work for a long time and was more perceptive than most gave him credit for. That didn't mean he'd jump at such an invitation. He had only made partial headway on his first few days on the island. Sal was still petrified of him, and Fee was dismissive, but Talia only threatened to bury him in her garden once or twice per day. And Chauncey seemed happy about anything and everything, especially when he got to deliver fresh towels or bedsheets to Linus, always managing to cough politely enough to ensure a tip. Theodore, of course, thought the sun rose and set because of Linus, something that shouldn't have tugged at his heartstrings as much as it did. It was only a button. For now, in fact. Linus had decided one of his dress shirts was ready for retirement, and he would snip a new button each morning. And that they were plastic and not brass didn't seem to matter to Theodore. Lucy, on the other hand, was still an enigma. A terrifying enigma, to be sure, given that he was the Antichrist, but an enigma nonetheless. Just the day before, Linus had found himself in the library of the main house, an old room on the first floor filled with books from floor to ceiling. He'd been perusing the shelves when he'd caught movement in the shadows out of the corner of his eye. He whirled around, but there was nothing there. Until he looked up to see Lucy crouched on the top of a bookshelf, staring down at him with bright eyes and a twisted smirk on his face. Linus gasped, heart racing. Lucy said,
"Hello, Mr. Baker. You would do well to remember that human souls are cheap trinkets to one such as me."
He giggled and leapt from the bookshelf, landing on his feet. He looked up at Linus and whispered,
"I love cheap trinkets."
And then he'd run from the library. Linus saw him only an hour later, munching on an oatmeal raisin cookie in the kitchen, bopping his head along with the coasters, singing about how they were going to find her, searching every which way. So, no, Linus wasn't necessarily jumping on the invitation, but he had a job to do. It was why he was here. And the more he learned about Lucy, the better prepared he'd be when reporting to extremely upper management. It had nothing to do with the idea of also getting to know Mr. Parnassus a little better. And even if it did, it was because the file on the master told him next to nothing, and he needed to be thorough. It was outlined as such in the Rules and Regulations, page 138, paragraph 6, and he would follow it to the letter. "Does he know I'll be there?" Linus asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. Mr. Parnassus chuckled. It was his idea. "Oh dear," Linus said faintly. "Should I tell him to expect you?" No, he shouldn't. In fact, he should tell Lucy that Linus had taken ill and would be down for the evening. And then Linus could spend his Friday night in his pajamas, listening to the little radio in the living room and pretending he was at home. It wasn't a record player, but it would do in a pinch. "Yes," he said. "I will be there." Mr. Parnassus smiled widely. Linus felt his skin flush at the sight of it. "Wonderful," he said. "I think you'll be surprised. 5 o'clock sharp, Mr. Baker." He whirled on his heel and headed toward the main house, whistling a jaunty tune. Linus closed the door and slumped against it. "Well, old boy, you've stepped into it now, haven't you?" Calliope sat in the windowsill, blinking slowly in the sunlight. Linus Baker had never been the religious sort. While he didn't mind if others were, it was never for him. His mother had been, not quite fervent, but so close that there was barely a difference. She took him to church on Sundays, and he'd sit in his freshly starched shirt that itched terribly, and would stand when he was supposed to stand, and kneel when he was supposed to kneel. He liked the hymns, though he couldn't carry a tune if he'd been given a bucket, but that was about it. He thought it was preposterous. The idea of fire and brimstone, that sinners went to hell while everyone else went to heaven. Sins seemed to be subjective. Oh, murder was bad, and harming others was too, but was that comparable to someone who'd nicked a candy bar from the corner store when they were 9 years old? Because if it was, Linus was destined for hell, given the crunchy bar he'd slipped into his pocket and consumed late at night while hiding under his comforter. When he'd become old enough to understand the power of the word no, he hadn't had to go to church after that. No, he'd told Mother. No, I don't think I want to go. She'd been upset, of course. She worried about his soul, telling him that he was going to go on a path from which he wouldn't be able to return. There would be drugs and booze and girls, and she would be there to pick up the pieces because that's what a mother did. And, he thought, to tell him, I told you so. But as it turned out, drugs were never a problem. And while Linus did enjoy a glass of wine with dinner once a month, it never turned into more than that. And as for girls, his mother needn't have worried. By then, Linus had already noticed how his skin had tingled when his 17-year-old neighbor, Timmy Wellington, mowed the lawn without his shirt on. No, girls weren't going to bring about Linus Baker's downfall. So, no, Linus hadn't been of the religious sort at all. Granted, that was before he knew the Antichrist was a 6-year-old on Marsyas Island. For the first time in his life, Linus wished he had a crucifix, or a Bible, or something with which to protect himself should Lucy decide he needed a sacrifice in order to come into his full powers. It certainly didn't help when he passed Fee and Talia in the garden, both of them watching every step he took toward the main house.
Dead man walking,
Talia intoned in a flat voice.
We got a dead man walking here.
Fee covered up her laughter with a cough. Good afternoon, he said stiffly.
Good afternoon, Mr. Baker,
Fee and Talia said sweetly, though Linus knew better. They whispered behind him as he reached the porch to the main house. He glanced back at them, and they waved cheekily. Oddly, he found himself struggling against a smile at the sight of them. He scowled instead. He walked inside the house. He heard Miss Chapelwhite singing in the kitchen. She'd warmed up to him considerably ever since their trip to the beach. And by that, he meant she acknowledged his presence with a nod that almost seemed cordial, rather than perfunctory. He closed the door behind him and heard a chirp coming from the couch in front of the fireplace. He looked down to see a scaly tail sticking out from underneath. Hello, Theodore, he said. The tail disappeared, and Theodore stuck his head out, tongue flicking. He chirped again, this time a question. Linus didn't need to speak Wyvern to understand what he was asking for. I already gave you one this morning. The more you get, the less you appreciate their worth. He felt a little silly, given that plastic buttons were worth nothing at all, but it still felt important to impart such a lesson. Theodore sighed morosely and disappeared back under the couch, grumbling to himself. He walked up the stairs, the wood creaking ominously under his weight. The sconces on the walls appeared to flicker, and Linus told himself it was just because the house was old and the wiring probably could use some upkeep. He made a mental note to ask in his report about the status of funding to the Marsyas orphanage. Mr. Parnassus had seemed dismissive at the idea of funding, but Linus thought he had to be mistaken. The doors to the bedrooms on the second floor were shut on either side of him, with the exception of Chauncey's. Linus was about to pass his room when he stopped, hearing Chauncey talking inside. He peeked through the slightly open door to see Chauncey, standing in salt water in front of a full-length mirror near the window, a porter's cap on his head between the stalks of his eyes. How do you do, Mr. and Mrs. Worthington? Chauncey asked, one of his tentacles lifting the cap as he bowed low. Welcome back to the Everland Hotel. May I take your luggage? Oh, why, thank you for noticing, Mrs. Worthington. Yes, I did get a new uniform. Only the best for Everland. I do hope you enjoy your stay. Linus left him to it. He wondered if it would be too much to get Chauncey a coat to complete his costume. Perhaps he could see if there was something in the village. No, that wasn't what he was here for. He was here to observe and nothing more. He couldn't influence the orphanage. It wouldn't be proper. The rules and regulations were specific about such matters. He thought he heard movement behind Sal's door, but it was shut tight. Best not to attempt to say hello. He wouldn't want to frighten the poor boy. In addition to having never seen inside of Sal's room, he had yet to go through the last door in the hall. Mr. Parnassus hadn't invited him before today, though Lucy had on numerous occasions, much to Linus's chagrin. He knew he'd have to inspect both before he left the island, but he'd been putting it off this first week, something he shouldn't have done. He stood in front of the door for a long moment before taking a deep breath and raising his shaking hand to knock. Before he could, the door unlatched and opened just a smidge. Linus took a step back. There didn't seem to be any light coming from inside. He cleared his throat. "Hello?" No response. He steeled his nerves and pushed open the door. The late afternoon sun had been bright when he'd walked inside the house, the sea air warm, but the interior of the room reminded him of being back in the city, dark and cold and dank. He took a step inside, and then another, and then another. The door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat. He was reaching for the door when candles flared to life around him, spouts of fire reaching up 2 feet or more.
Welcome to my domain,
A child's voice rang out behind him.
You have entered here at my invitation.
The voice cackled.
Bear witness to the true depth of my power. I am Lucifer. I am Beelzebub, the prince of devils. I am...
Going to find yourself with a loss of privileges if you should decide to continue, Linus heard Mr. Parnassus say. The candles snuffed out. The darkness faded. Sunlight poured in through the window. Linus blinked against the bright light. Mr. Parnassus sat in a high-backed chair near the window, legs crossed, hands in his lap, an amused expression on his face. There was an empty chair across from him, undoubtedly for the boy who lay on his back on the thick rug. He heard you coming, Mr. Parnassus said with a shrug. I cautioned him against it, but since this is his time to do as he wishes, I thought he shouldn't be stifled. Lucy looked up at Linus, who was plastered against the bedroom door.
I am who I am.
Quite, Linus said, his voice a squeak, barely able to peel himself from the door. The room itself was large and spacious. There was a 4-poster bed set against the far wall, made of dark wood, ornate vines and leaves carved into the posts. There was a desk, far older than the others in the house, covered in reams of paper and stacks of books. An unlit fireplace set opposite the bed. If Linus hadn't just been frightened half out of his mind, he would have thought it would be perfect for cold winter nights. Would you like to show Mr. Baker your room? Mr. Parnassus asked Lucy. He'd probably like to see it very much, wouldn't you, Mr. Baker? No, he wouldn't. Not very much at all. Yes, Linus said. That certainly seems doable. Lucy turned over on his stomach, propping his chin in his hands.
Are you sure, Mr. Baker? You don't sound so sure.
I'm sure, Linus said firmly. Lucy picked himself up off the ground.
Well, don't say I didn't warn you.
Mr. Parnassus sighed. Lucy, you're going to give Mr. Baker the wrong idea.
And what idea would that be?
You know what? Lucy threw his hands up.
I'm just trying to build anticipation. Expect the unexpected. You told me that life is meant to surprise you. I'm trying to surprise him.
I think you're setting yourself up for nothing but disappointment. Lucy's eyes narrowed.
And whose fault is that? If you'd had listened to my decorating ideas, there would be no room for disappointment. There would only be joy.
He glanced at Linus.
Well, for me.
Mr. Parnassus spread his hands in a placating gesture. I don't think having severed human heads is conducive to a good night's sleep, or the health and sanity of Mr. Baker, even if they were to be made of papier-mâché. Severed heads? Linus asked in a strangled voice. Lucy sighed.
Just representations of my enemies. The Pope, evangelicals who attend megachurches. You know, like normal people have.
Linus didn't think Lucy quite had the grasp of what was normal, but he managed to keep that to himself. So, no heads?
None, Lucy said with a scowl. Not even the skull of an animal from the woods that I didn't kill and just found.
He shot a glare at Mr. Parnassus. What did I say about animals? Mr. Parnassus said. Lucy stomped toward a closed door near the chairs.
I'm not supposed to kill them because only serial killers do that, and if they're already dead, I can't play with the remains because I'll smell bad.
And?
And it's wrong.
Let's lead with that next time, Mr. Parnassus said. It might sound more humane.
Stifling my creativity,
Lucy muttered. He put his hand on the doorknob and looked over at Linus. His disgruntled expression disappeared, and that syrupy, sweet smile returned that caused chills to run down Linus's spine.
Are you coming, Mr. Baker?
Linus tried to make his feet move, but they remained firmly rooted near the bedroom door. Is Mr. Parnassus joining us? He asked. Mr. Parnassus shook his head. I'll let him give you the tour, as the other children did. He paused. Then, I'm still working on Sal. Great, Linus said weakly. That's fine.
Why are you sweating?
Lucy asked, smile widening.
Something wrong, Mr. Baker?
No, Linus said. Just a little over-warm is all. Temperate climate, you know. Not used to it back in the city.
Oh, of course, Lucy said. That must be it. Come here, Mr. Baker. I have something to show you.
Linus swallowed thickly. He told himself he was being foolish, that Mr. Parnassus was right there, and Lucy wouldn't dare do anything untoward in his presence. The problem with that was Linus's brain chose that exact moment to wonder if there had ever been another caseworker to visit the island before, and what became of them. There had to have been, right? He can't have been the first. Why, the idea was preposterous. And if there had been others before him, what had become of them? Had they too entered Lucy's room, only to never be seen again? Would Linus follow Lucy through the door to find the carcasses of his predecessors nailed to the ceiling above the bed? Linus certainly could be firm when he needed to be, but he did have a weak constitution, and the sight of blood tended to cause him to feel woozy. He didn't know what would happen if he had to see intestines strewn about like wet, decorative gardens. He glanced at Mr. Parnassus, who nodded encouragingly. It did not soothe Linus in the slightest. For all he knew, Mr. Parnassus was just as evil as Lucy, brightly colored socks and wonderful smile be damned. He nearly tripped at wonderful smile. He pushed it away. He could do this. He could do this. It was just a child. He fixed a pleasant look on his face, barely above a grimace, and said, I would be delighted to see your room, Lucy. I do hope it's tidy. A disheveled room is the sign of a disheveled mind. It's best to keep things clean when possible. Lucy's eyes danced.
Is that right, Mr. Baker? Well, let's see what my mind is like then.
Linus was sure this was one of the stressors his physician had warned him of. There was nothing he could do about that now. He stopped next to Lucy. He looked down at him. Lucy grinned. Linus thought he had more teeth than was humanly possible. He turned the doorknob. He pushed open the door. It creaked on its hinges and revealed a small space with a twin bed against one wall, the comforter plaid, the pillowcase white. There was room enough for a bureau, but not much else. Atop the bureau sat a collection of shiny rocks, shot with veins of quartz. On the walls were vinyl records, each hung on a pushpin through the hole in its middle. There was Little Richard, the Big Bopper, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Richie Valens and Buddy Holly. In fact, there were more Buddy Holly records than any other. Linus was startled at the sight of them. He recognized most of the records because he had them back in the city at his own home. Many nights had been spent listening to Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day and Chantilly Lace. But aside from Little Richard and Frankie Lyman, they all had something else in common. It was slightly morbid when he thought about it, but it made sense. He hadn't even noticed Lucy had closed the door behind them.
The day the music died,
Lucy said. Linus spun around, heart tripping all over itself. Lucy stood at the door, back pressed against it. What? He waved a hand toward the records.
Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper.
A plane crash, Linus said quietly. Lucy nodded and pushed himself off the door.
Richie and Bopper weren't even supposed to be on the plane. Did you know that?
He did. He said, I think so.
Bopper was sick and took someone else's seat.
Waylon Jennings, though Linus kept that to himself.
And Richie won his seat in a coin toss. Buddy didn't want to be stuck in a bus because it was cold and they had to go to Montana.
Lucy reached up and touched Chantilly Lace. He looked almost reverent.
The pilot wasn't given the correct weather information, and the plane didn't have the proper instruments needed to fly. Weird, right?
He smiled at Linus.
I like music that makes me happy, and I like death. It's strange how people can mix the two. They all died by chance, and then people sang about them after. I like those songs, but not as much as the ones sung by dead people.
Linus coughed roughly. I like music too. I have some of these records at my house. Lucy perked up at that.
Dead people music?
He shrugged. I guess. The older the music, the more likely the singer is dead.
Yeah,
Lucy breathed. His eyes began to tinge with red.
That's true. Death is wonderful to music. It makes the singers sound like ghosts.
Linus thought it was probably a good time to change the subject to something less morbid. I like your room. Lucy looked around, the light fading from his eyes.
It's the best. I like having my own room. Arthur says that it's important to have independence.
He glanced at Linus before looking away, and Linus could have sworn he looked almost nervous.
Just as long as he doesn't go too far away.
His eyes widened.
But I'm not a baby. I can be fine by myself. In fact, I'm by myself all the time.
Linus arched an eyebrow. All the time? Oh, no. No. That won't do. I'll need to have a word with Mr. Parnassus if that's the case. A child of your age should never be by himself all the time.
I didn't mean it like that,
Lucy cried.
What I meant was that I'm never by myself. Ever. Everywhere I go, he's there. He's like a shadow. It's so annoying.
Well, if you say so. Lucy nodded furiously.
I do. That's exactly what I said. So, no need to talk to Arthur about it or put it in reports and say bad things about me.
His smile was positively angelic.
I swear I'm a good person.
The smile faded.
And you don't need to worry about looking under my bed. And if you do, the bird skeleton under it isn't mine, and I don't know who put it there, but they should be punished because it's wrong.
He smiled again. Linus stared at him.
Okay,
he said, stepping forward and grabbing Linus by the hand.
That's it. That's my room. No need to see anything else.
He pulled Linus toward the door and flung it open.
Arthur, he saw my room and said everything looks good and there's nothing bad in it at all and that I'm a good person and he likes the same music as me, dead people music.
Mr. Parnassus looked up from the book in his lap. Is that right? Dead people music? Lucy lifted his head up to look at Linus, still holding his hand tightly.
We like dead things, don't we, Mr. Baker?
Linus sputtered. Lucy let him go and collapsed on the floor at Mr. Parnassus's feet, where he'd been when Linus had arrived. He folded his hands on his stomach and stared up at the ceiling.
My brain is filled with spiders burrowing their eggs in the gray matter. Soon they'll hatch and consume me.
Linus had no idea what to do with that. Thankfully, it appeared Mr. Parnassus did. He closed the book in his lap and set it on the small table next to the chairs. He tapped one of his wingtip shoes against Lucy's shoulder. How descriptive. We'll discuss that more in detail in just a moment. First, Mr. Baker would like to observe. Would that be all right with you? Lucy glanced at Linus before looking back toward the ceiling.
That's fine. He likes dead things almost as much as I do.
That wasn't even remotely true. Indeed, Mr. Parnassus said, motioning for Linus to sit in the vacant chair. How fortuitous. Where did we leave off before Mr. Baker arrived? Linus sat. He pulled his notepad out, along with his pencil. He didn't know why his fingers were shaking.
Categorical imperative,
Lucy said.
Can't.
Ah, that's right, Mr. Parnassus said. Thank you for reminding me. Linus got the idea that he didn't need to be reminded at all. And what did Kant say about the categorical imperative? Lucy sighed.
That it's the supreme principle of morality. It's an objective. A rationally necessary and unconditional principle that we must always follow despite any natural desires or inclinations to the contrary.
And was Kant right?
That to be immoral is to be irrational?
Yes. Lucy scrunched up his face.
No?
And why not?
Because people aren't black and white. No matter how hard you try, you can't stay on one path without diversions, and that doesn't mean you're a bad person.
Mr. Parnassus nodded. Even if you have spiders in your brain? Lucy shrugged.
Maybe. But Kant was talking about normal people. I'm not normal.
Why is that? He tapped his stomach.
Because of where I came from.
Where did you come from?
A vagina, after it was penetrated by a penis.
Lucy, Mr. Parnassus admonished as Linus choked. Lucy rolled his eyes. He shifted as if he were uncomfortable.
I came from a place where things weren't so good.
Are they better now?
Mostly.
Why do you think that is? Lucy squinted up at Linus before turning his head toward Mr. Parnassus.
Because I have my own room here, and my records, and you, and the others. Even though Theodore won't let me see his hoard.
And the spiders?
Still there.
But
I can have spiders in my head as long as I don't let them consume me and then destroy the world as we know it.
Linus could barely breathe. Mr. Parnassus didn't seem to have that problem. He was smiling. Exactly. To err is to be human, irrational or not. And while some mistakes are bigger than others, if we learn from them, we become better people. Even if we have spiders in our brains.
I'm unholy.
So some people say. Lucy's face scrunched up as if he was thinking hard.
Arthur?
Yes?
Did you know your name is a mountain?
Mr. Parnassus blinked as if he'd been caught off guard. I did. How did you know that? Lucy shrugged.
I know a lot of things, but I don't always know how I know them. Does that make sense?
Sort of.
Mount Parnassus was sacred to Apollo.
I know.
And do you know Linus of Thrace?
Mr. Parnassus shifted in his seat. I don't think so.
Oh, well, Apollo killed Linus with his arrows because of a musical contest. Are you going to kill Mr. Baker?
Lucy turned his head slowly to look at Linus.
If you do, can you make sure to use arrows? I don't want him to be unholy, too.
He began to cackle. Mr. Parnassus sighed as Linus's chest hitched. Did you just tell that entire story to be able to make a joke?
Yes,
Lucy said, wiping his eyes.
Because you told me once that if we can't laugh at ourselves, we're doing it wrong.
He frowned.
Am I doing it wrong? Nobody seems to be laughing.
Humor is subjective, I'm afraid, Mr. Parnassus said.
That's unfortunate,
Lucy said, staring back at the ceiling.
Humanity is so weird. If we're not laughing, we're crying, or running for our lives because monsters are trying to eat us. And they don't even have to be real monsters. They could be the ones we make up in our heads. Don't you think that's weird?
I suppose, but I'd rather be that way than the alternative.
Which is?
Not feeling anything at all. Linus looked away. Lucy was delighted when Mr. Parnassus ended the session early at 6:15. He was told he could head to the kitchen to see if Miss Chapelwhite needed his help. He jumped up and spun in a little circle as he stomped his feet before heading toward the door, bellowing over his shoulder that he hoped Linus found their time together illuminating. Linus wasn't sure illuminating was the right word. They sat in silence as Lucy descended the stairs, making far too much noise for a boy his size. It sounded as if he bounced off every surface he could find on his way to the first floor. Linus knew Mr. Parnassus was waiting on him, and he took the opportunity to gather his thoughts as best he could. His notepad was distressingly blank. He'd forgotten to take down a single observation. That wasn't good for someone in his position, but he thought he was owed a little leeway with all he'd seen and heard since arriving on the island. "He's not what I expected," Linus finally said, staring off into nothing. "No?" He shook his head. "There's connotations behind the name. Antichrist." He looked apologetically at Mr. Parnassus. "If I'm being honest." "Is there?" Mr. Parnassus asked dryly. "I hadn't noticed." "I'm not sorry for that." "And I don't expect you to be." Mr. Parnassus looked down at his hands. "Can I tell you a secret?" That startled Linus. He'd gathered that the master of Marsyas didn't dispense his secrets often. It was infuriating, but understandable. "Yes, of course."
Oh.
"I worried, too, when I heard he was being sent to the island." Linus stared at him. "You worried?" Mr. Parnassus arched an eyebrow. Linus found that he had to remind himself that according to his file, this man was 5 years older than he. He looked oddly young. Linus didn't know why, but he sat a little straighter, and if he sucked in his stomach slightly, it was no one's business but his own. "Why do you sound so offended?" "I worry when the bus is late. I worry when I sleep through my alarm. I worry when I go to the store on the weekends, and avocados are so expensive. Those are worries, Mr. Parnassus." "Those are mundane," he corrected gently.